The Minnesota Wild are dealing with injuries and inconsistency early. Seth Toupal of Locked On Wild is here to talk about that and how they can get out of their funk next on the Locked On NHL Podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show a familiar face and voice to Locked On NHL fans, Seth Toupal of Locked On Wild. And Seth, another tough overtime loss for the Wild on Sunday against Winnipeg. What's going on here for the Minnesota Wild that they're sort of inconsistent early in the season?
Well, I think the phrase, Gil, that I would use is the Wild just are not quite there. I think is what it really comes down to. You had the game against the Seattle Kraken that I feel like kind of slipped away from the Wilds. You know, they had the lead. They had a 2-0 lead. Credit to the Kraken for being able to battle back in pretty much every instance. The Wilds, 2-0 lead. All of a sudden it turns into a 2-2 game. Then the Wild lead 3-2, then 4-3. And so they kept battling, but the Kraken just were able to have an answer every time the Wilds grabbed the lead. Now, in the game against the Jets, second night of a back-to-back, so just tough circumstances there, I felt like the Wild did a really good job of just kind of battling through. Like, they had very tired legs, clearly. You're battling a tough Winnipeg team on the road against one of the best goalies in the league, and the Wilds more than held their own. It just came down to not being able to take advantage of some odd man rush opportunities. You pot one of those goals. Marco Rossi had a couple of chances in close. Ryan Hartman had an odd man rush in which he was just not able to kind of separate from the Jets defenders. Freddie Gaudreau had another one as well. You take advantage of one of those, it feels like you are able to, maybe steal a win against the Jets on the road. And same thing against Seattle. In overtime, Marco Rossi, Matt Boldy, and Kirill Kaprizov all had opportunities in the OT. They just were not able to get them past Joey Daccord. And so the early part of the season here, it feels like the Wild are just coming up short on their opportunities. I don't get the sense that this is like oh great, here we go again from what happened last year, because in a lot of those games, the Wild were being just thoroughly outclassed by the teams that they played. They were, by and large, the better team against Seattle. They were a tired team against the Jets, but they had moments in which they were able to sustain offensive presence. And so it doesn't look like a team that's just getting thoroughly beat. It's a team that is just coming up a little short with the opportunities they've had so far.
And injuries have clearly played a role. A lot of injuries around the league, but the Wild in particular have been hit hard. Talk to me about the injury situation and the long-term outlook for some of these players.
Well, we've got one sigh of relief and one hold your breath so far for the Minnesota Wild. Gil Eriksson-Ek, who was out of the game against the Winnipeg Jets due to a broken nose, took an elbow against the Seattle Kraken, left the game. He came back with basically a night helmet to try to keep his face from further damage. Didn't work out, so they pulled him from the rest of the game, and then he didn't travel with the team. But he is expected to be available on Tuesday against the St. Louis Blues, so that's good. That is a sigh of relief. Potentially concerning is that Jared Spurgeon was also out of the Winnipeg Jets game and is day-to-day with a, quote, lower body injury. No designation as to what it is. And Gil, I'm going to be honest, I was racking my brain to try to think of any play that could have led to Jared Spurgeon getting hurt over the first 2 games of the season, and I couldn't think of anything. Doesn't mean there wasn't something, but there was nothing that stood out as, okay, this is definitely where an injury was sustained. But Spurgeon coming into the season off of back and hip surgery, it got so bad last year that he basically, every time he would come off the ice for a shift, he had to retie his skates because his feet were numb. And so he just was dealing with just outrageous things that you wouldn't wish on anybody. So that, I guess, is my chief concern, is that it is some sort of a re-aggravation of that situation. But I would imagine we'll get an update here this week. That is a big one for the Wild if Spurgeon is going to miss any level of time, because he just, not only does his play on the ice help the defense tremendously, but just in positioning everybody else and slotting everybody else in their regular spot in the lineup are just crucial to what this team is trying to get accomplished. So if he misses any sort of long-term amount of time, that's a tough blow for this Wild team.
How would they address it? Who would be the next man up in that situation?
So fortunately, the Wild have a guy named Brock Faber who just stepped into every pair of shoes imaginable last season. He would be the one, I think, that would step in to take a lot of those responsibilities that Spurgeon primarily is in charge of. And to be honest, he has taken some of them already. Faber is now the primary quarterback of the top power play unit, so he'll keep that. I would imagine he slots in a little more on the penalty kill. Declan Chisholm would probably take Spurgeon's time on the power play if he is out for an extended period. But this team is then going to rely, like they did in the game against the Jets. They're going to rely on that top 4 of Jonas Brodin, Brock Faber, Jake Middleton, and Zach Bogosian to really do a lot of the heavy lifting, which is a solid unit, but it just doesn't have that same dimension to it that they do when Spurgeon's in the lineup.
You mentioned earlier that you felt like the Wild were just not quite yet there. What do they have to do to get there besides get healthy?
I think one big thing is just getting the first and second lines going at the same time. In the first game of the season against the Blue Jackets, the Matt Boldy line, the second line did pretty much all of the heavy lifting. They looked really, really good in that game, and they were one of the primary reasons the Wild were able to get that win. Against Seattle, it was Kirill Kaprizov's turn, and his line looked fantastic. They were the best line on the ice. In the game against the Jets, I still felt like Kaprizov's line did a good job of pushing the offense, just couldn't quite get anything past Connor Hellebuck. Second line was a little quiet. And so if the Wild can get those 2 lines going, that's going to really cause some issues for opponents, because if it's just the Kaprizov line, that's where all the attention defensively is going to go, especially on the road. Teams that the Wild go up against are just going to put their best defensive line out there against that trio and just try to take them out of the equation entirely. So if you have 2 lines that are capable of scoring on a consistent basis, then that limits what your opponent can do, and that takes away some of that last change advantage on the road especially. And so if that Boldy line can just be a consistent driver of offense to complement the Kaprizov line, that's going to help this team. That's going to help them propel the offense forward, and that's going to keep them, I think, in a lot of these games. It's just when you're expecting one line to do everything, that's when things get tricky.
Yeah, no question about that. And hopefully, from a Wild perspective, they can straighten things out and get those 2 lines going. Seth, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
You can follow me on X at Seth, Toups. All my Minnesota sports takes. The Vikings were off this weekend, which I think was a was a nice little stress-free weekend for me, tweeting out my sports takes. But you can find the show at Locked On Wild. We got lucky, and it's at Locked On Wild for everything. So just search. You'll find all that we have to offer, and we'll keep you up to date all Minnesota Wild season long, and mixing in a little PWHL coverage here this season as well. So be on the lookout for that too.
All right, Seth, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you could start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the very same page where you place your bets. And you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. October, my favorite month in the sports calendar. You've got the baseball playoffs, college and pro football. Hockey is back, hockey fans. So check out all the latest odds for your favorite team on FanDuel. And again, you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook.